So as we move into the foundations of the Enneagram, I always start with this thing that I call the Awareness V. It's a continuum of awareness. And the Awareness V is a way for us to think about how our attention changes so dramatically in different states of being. The Awareness Continuum, I believe, is one of the key things that we have to become aware of if we're going to move out of the trances of our daily lives and really wake up. And so I'm going to say something here at the beginning that may sound a little bit odd, but this awareness factor is far more important than your Enneagram type. The Enneagram type is simply a tool to help you wake up to your awareness. So with this symbol of the awareness, think of the bottom of the V, as I like to call it, as a point where you are the most reactive. It's where you are caught up in something so significantly. So the other day I was driving the speed limit, as I often do, and I was on a kind of a divided highway. The speed limit was 45 miles an hour. And this person came very close to me and was riding on my bumper. And I became even more stubborn. Now, my wife would have found any way to get out of this lane, but no, I'm not going to move for this guy. So I got into a very reactive state, and I had all kinds of creative and unkind thoughts about this person behind me. Well, little by little, he was able to get around me and sped off and ended up taking an exit. And as he went by, I found myself taking a deep breath because really I was afraid when he was so close to me. But as I took that deep breath, I kind of went from that bottom of the V to a little bit wider awareness, and I started to wonder, why was this young man in such a hurry? What's going on in his life that speed was so important? So I started to get behind the stories that I was layering onto him a bit and not believe them in the same way that I did when I was at the bottom of the V. And in my best moments, and I don't go here as often as I would like, I might even go up toward the top of that awareness V and send him a blessing for his journey and his day. It's a hard thing to be a young person in this world today. And he needs all of the blessings and all of the good energy that we can offer. So this journey from that reactive point up to this very expansive space where we can offer blessing, where we can offer the best of ourselves to other people, is the journey we're on all the time. So just to go over this Enneagram V, or this awareness V, one more time. At the bottom of the V, we're in ego. It's often very fear-based, and it tends to come out through controlling behavior. For some, it might be protective. For other people, it might be a kind of complying. But we're in that trance state where we're really not fully awake to ourselves. And as we move up this V, we start to get more curious. We start to open up. Our thinking expands some. And we tend to become more allowing and accepting of differences. And then as we move toward the top of the V, we really move in an inspired and an expansive state. We become more authentic, loving, generous, and hope-filled. So this Awareness V continuum that we're talking about is going to be navigated very differently by each of the 9 types. Each of the 9 types is going to have a bottom of the V kind of experience that we'll look at. We're going to be able to trace the journey of the type up to more of this middle of the range awareness. And then for each of the types, it's going to have this very expansive and inspired state. So this Awareness V complies and goes right along with a lot of the levels of development that have been a part of psychology. And so it reflects a lot of very contemporary knowledge about how human development works. So at the bottom of the V, we talk about the level of egocentric. Egocentric is that place where we're not able to reference anything outside of our own needs and wants. We're completely caught up in our own journey and own story. All of us go there, well, maybe 99% of us go there, into this egocentric state from time to time. And then from that, we move into a reactive state. Actually, reactive is a little bit more awake than egocentric because it's now in dialogue with something else. And then from reactive, the human being moves into this creative space where it's no longer tied into what other people are thinking or doing or wanting, but it's now coming out of the self, and it's the best self emerging and interacting in the world. And then there is an inspired self. This is that state of life that Rumi was talking about. It's a form of presence that is dramatically different in ways from our typical ego-based selves. And we're going to be going into that in some detail through the Enneagram. And then we have this thing called the set point. This is where we tend to hang out in most of our life and most of our days. The set point is where, on our best days, we're functioning up toward the top of that level of awareness. And then on our worst days, we go down to the bottom. And if things are really bad, we drop below. If things are really great, we go above. But we tend to hang out in the set point. Now, the set point doesn't tend to shift much in our lives. And that's reflective of why it's so hard to change, why we get into ruts. But the set point will change through two primary conditions. If we experience trauma or abuse in some ways, that set point tends to drop. And this is true for people as well as nations. So when 9/11 hit our country, our set point as a nation dropped. We became much more fear-based as a country. The other movement is also possible, and this is the experience of transformation, that sort of way in which we get completely recalibrated as a self, and the set point shifts up. And I suspect all of you, any of you that are attracted to the Enneagram and are watching this, have had those experiences where you really have a deep kind of transformation, and it changes who you are. So this is the movement that we're doing all the time, and the Enneagram is going to put it into some pretty interesting perspective for each of the types. So I'd like to break this down into even more of a simple format in some ways and look at the awareness through really two levels of consciousness. One of them is an ego-based consciousness. And those first three levels of development are really all a part of our ego self. The ego self is that part that is aware of being a separate human being in the world. We have a separate identity, and we have a real stake in keeping that separate self happy and healthy and protected. So that separate self can take a form as an egocentric person, as a reactive person, or as a creative person. And this journey from reactive into creative is the human story. It's nothing that we need to be ashamed of. So we all have this sense of self, the ego. That's an important thing to be aware of and to nurture. But then there's this other level of consciousness, and again, this is where Rumi is talking about life. It's this spiritual heightened state of consciousness that no longer is functioning out of an ego mode. We talk about it as inspired, we talk about it as presence, we talk about it as being a sacred kind of transcendent experience. All of the religious traditions, the spiritual traditions, have awareness of this other dimension of being and of life. And it is the dimension that the Enneagram is driving us toward. Now, if you read about the Enneagram or do much exploration through YouTube's, most of the Enneagram is being looked at through the lens of ego and through the lens of psychology. And there's great benefit that comes from that. But what I feel is the most exciting aspect of the Enneagram is really the way in which it invites us into this higher state of consciousness, into this inspired way of being in the world. And from that perspective, everything feels and looks differently as we move through the world. Again, we've tasted it. I suspect all of us that are exploring the Enneagram to any depth have tasted this higher level of consciousness. And the invitation of the Enneagram is to spend more time there. And this has a lot of significance because the way that our awareness, our level of awareness, is going to drive how we are interacting in the world. It drives our behavior. So what's unique about the Enneagram is it's not actually looking at how we're behaving. Some of the other typologies will do that, Myers-Briggs and Insights and DISC, and some of those are very helpful and good, but they tend to be looking at the level of behavior. The Enneagram is different because it's really getting at the underlying motivation that is generating behavior. So when we're at the bottom of the V, the motivation that's driving our behavior is all reactive instinct. It's completely below our consciousness. So as I think about that guy driving up quickly behind me, I'm going into this instinctual sort of response that gets activated. And then as we move up a little bit more into the reactive space, we're now being motivated by subconscious beliefs. So it's still beneath our level of awareness, but now we're moving into beliefs. And that's where I started generating some stories about the guy behind me. And then as we move up even more in awareness, we start to get in touch with our values and our conscious beliefs. And those start to motivate how we're behaving in the world. So there's a big difference between behaving out of instinct, that's reactive, and behaving out of our values and our conscious beliefs. All three of these levels are still levels of the ego, and it is this next shift that is the powerful one, where we're really moving into inspiration and intuition. The shift into this inspired level has a completely different power source in a way. When we're in our ego states, we're really being powered by what we know, what's in our instinct, what's in our subconscious. The shift into this higher form of consciousness is now a source of power, a source of knowing that comes from beyond. It may be your sense of the universe, it may be a sense of God, it may just be what you understand to be your best self, but there's a way in which that it comes from beyond and informs who we are and how we think. So this leap from ego into the inspired state is what the Enneagram is going to be inviting us into. Now I want to look at one other aspect of this Awareness V that I think is so important, because it really helps us to understand why we get so worn out. It's to look at the Awareness V through the lens of our energy. So there's been some really interesting research around the energetics of emotion. There's a man, David Hawkins, who has done a lot of research and writing about this. When we're at the bottom of the V, we're in an awareness level that is energetically very costly. Shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, anger. These are all very normal human emotions, and each of them has a very important function. But if we stay in any of them for too long, we really end up having our energy drained. As we move up in the Awareness V, we now start to encounter and engage different emotions. That shift from anger into the next level of emotion is a very profound one. It's the shift from our more reactive self into this transition state where we're starting to become courageous. And that's the shift from anger into courage. Courage is now a state where we have some agency about us. We're not just reacting to something. So that shift from courage then can move us into an experience of acceptance, where we stop fighting life, but we start to dance with life. And then as we move up into a higher energy, a higher emotion, we're starting to engage empathy and even enthusiasm. And these are energy states or emotional states that are starting to give back. They're high energy states in the best sense of the word. So this journey through the emotional continuum has a very powerful kind of effect, because the thing about this energy state is that when we're in a low reactive state, we cannot run the emotions that are present in the higher form. So for example, when that guy drives up behind me and I'm reactive, it's impossible for me to feel empathic toward him because I'm in this low reactive kind of state. So these higher emotional forms really require a corresponding width of awareness, in a sense. And then as we move into that next higher level of consciousness, more of that transcendent mode, a whole different quality of emotions come online. We talk about compassion, joy, peace, and love. And this is where, in an energetic way, we're really moving into flow, that flow state that many people are talking about, where we're no longer the power source, but we're kind of flowing with life as it's unfolding in us and around us. So this is the journey of awareness that I really want people who are looking at the Enneagram to keep in mind, because the Enneagram is going to look very differently according to where we are in this awareness continuum.